Shakespeare, a man who lived long before this new age laced with modern innovations and technological marvels, had a legacy so deep in literary work so timeless, from the unforgettable Romeo and Juliet to his repertoire of 39 timeless plays penned to his name. It'll be almost impossible to forget him forever. Yet hidden beneath his beautiful artistic creations is a hint of mystery. Have you ever wondered if Shakespeare really wrote those plays? What if Shakespeare was just a pen name for a ghostwriter? What if we told you that Shakespeare didn't write any of his plays? What if Shakespeare did really exist? What if? Stay tuned to find out. When you hear the name William Shakespeare, what comes to mind? Fame, wealth, skill, poetry, prowess, literature. Well, today we'll be adding a new word to your already very long list: conspiracy. Why? Oh well, because there are many reasons, many loopholes, and many theories that point to show that Shakespeare didn't write his plays, starting from his roots. So that leaves a need for us to answer the first question: who really was William Shakespeare? Well, to put it simply, he was one pretty interesting man. He fed us many compelling narratives to keep us preoccupied, but no one ever bothered to find out much about him. But anyway, here's what we know about Shakespeare. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. Shakespeare wasn't born great. He seemed to fall under the category of men who achieved greatness. He only got a basic education because his father was a glove maker. They weren't dirt poor, but they weren't rich either. Yet he got married very early. He was 18, and she, Anne Hathaway, was said to have been 26 years of age and 3 months with child at the time. The age difference and conditions surrounding their marriage were very unusual, but Shakespeare's dad and the church that had them joined didn't seem to worry so much. You'd expect any 18-year-old that impregnates a 26-year-old lady to be promiscuous, but he didn't seem to have been. The only other partner he had eyes for, except his wife, from what the records tell us, is his work. So, William Shakespeare got married in 1582. Then his wife bore him 3 kids, Susanna Hall, and then a set of twins, Hamnet Shakespeare and Judith Quiney, and then he was busy being a good dad and husband until 1589. He left. Not the bad kind where a man abandons his family to chase his dreams. It seemed more like he chased ambition to give his family a good life. But again, that's an assumption because there are very sparse records about Shakespeare's private life. What we do know, however, is that Shakespeare started out writing a lot of comedies, happy-go-lucky narratives, and some history. However, when he lost his one and only son to unknown causes at the young age of 11, the tragedies started rushing in. Seemed like Shakespeare didn't want to mourn alone, so he put his sorry into literary packages that make us mourn with him. Rumor even has it that the famous Hamlet was about his son, Hamnet. After years of dominating the film industry and earning titles like England's national poet and the Bard of Avon, he finally retired just before he clocked 50 and returned to loving permanently with his family until he died. To be or not to be, that is the question. How do you explain that the son of a poor glove maker in Stafford, who barely got enough education, is now one of the greatest writers and movie directors that ever lived? How do we explain that a man who didn't go to university wrote 3 extensive poems, 39 plays, and 154 sonnets? How could a man who had not traveled outside the shores of London and Stratford, according to history records, know so much about Italy, down to the most graphic details? While we might have been able to show that Shakespeare indeed has a family, there's a marriage certificate. We actually don't have much proof that he owned his literary works. No eyewitnesses, no personal letters. No one has actually ever seen any handwritten Shakespearean manuscript, which is very strange. How could such a successful writer not have any copies of his own work? The only real proof we have is that he writes his name on all his works. This is why some people argue that Shakespeare wasn't real, and it was probably a pen name used by someone who wanted to stay anonymous. Shakespeare's name is on all of his works. At his church baptism at birth, his given name was 𝐦𝐤𝐤𝐵 Shakespeare. Now, 𝐦𝐤𝐤𝐵 is actually a Latin word that basically means William, and he seemed to like it better. In all his 154 sonnets, he referred to himself as Will in his sonnets. Soon enough, his contemporaries started calling William Shakespeare just as he liked it. Clearly, the young man was very particular about his name, which sort of makes it less coincidental that he decorated all his works with it. Let's face it, in Shakespeare's time, writing wasn't a proud occupation. and many writers were shy, so anonymous writings were very common. So if any author needed their identity, they could do that easily. They wouldn't need to act as or claim to be William Shakespeare. But that's not the only thing that has people doubting the authenticity of Shakespeare's identity: his will. In Shakespeare's will, he did not mention any book or any letter at all. Not a single one, which is a bit odd for such an accomplished writer with golden pieces. In fact, many people went into a letter-writing frenzy after his death, forging letters that they had expected Shakespeare to write to the Queen, to his patron, and even to other writers like him. It was almost unbelievable that he didn't write any letter to anyone all the years of his career and after retirement, or rather, if he had, not a single one had survived. No books, not letters, not worn in progress. Absolutely nothing. It just seems really strange, unbelievable even. Do you think it's possible that a great writer like himself possessed none of these? Why didn't he leave any allowance for the future of his new plays? Because, in a shocking turn, we actually found out that about 18 plays which eventually became some of his greatest plays were still unpublished at the time he died. You'd expect this to be a priority for a dying writer who loved what he did. You'd expect him to make reference to it in his will, and even give specific instructions about how exactly and when he would like them published, but no, that didn't happen. We initially assumed that perhaps he had hidden them alongside the household effects he had left behind for Susanna Hall, his first daughter, and her husband, a doctor named John Hall. Again, no. After Dr. Hall died in 1635, he clearly specified none of the books he left behind belonged to or were affiliated with his famous father-in-law. Unlike Shakespeare, John Hall was very specific about whom he wanted his books and papers to remain with. In those days, books were very, very, very valuable. So, how did a will that meticulously itemized gifts for family and friends not have even one mention of a single book from Shakespeare's super extensive library of personal literary masterpieces? You know what's worse is the fact that his two children, Susanna and Judith, could neither read nor write. Isn't it interesting that the greatest of all time writer never taught his daughters to read or write his plays? Never. Did he not desire for them to read his work even once? How come this talented playwright who scribbled down many strong female roles in his plays, a champion of the English language with such a strong command of words, let his daughters remain illiterate? Really? Yes, we know and understand that girls weren't going to school then, but in his own plays we had many sciences of fathers teaching their daughters. In Tempest, Prospero Tempest, Miranda on the island in The Tempest. Or they could arrange for tutors to come in, as in the case of In the Taming of the Shrew. They hired a personal tutor, something Shakespeare could afford. Why did he do less in life and more in plays? We're talking about the children of a man who had a strong hatred for ignorance, who made his female characters in plays strong and smart. But somehow, he didn't do the same for his daughter. Sounds pretty unlikely, so perhaps he didn't write some of those plays. Another reason why many scholars doubt that Shakespeare wrote all those plays is his questionably vast knowledge. How was he able to learn beyond all natural cleverness with only basic education? It remains a mystery. If he spent some time going the extra mile and digging wells of knowledge, how come no one remembers this? Not wife, not daughters, not even friends. We once heard that he was probably taught most of what he knew by Mr. Thomas Jenkins, the headmaster of his school, King Edward VI's Grammar School in Stratford-upon-Avon. But how come this man never for once bragged about being a proud tutor? And if he was exceptionally smart, how come he didn't get a scholarship? They had a scholarship system even then, so how did he miss out? This is why many believe that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was the real Shakespeare, which sort of makes sense if you give it some thought. Think about it. Edward was high-born, he had the education, exposure, and connections to prove it. He was also well-traveled, so it makes more sense that he could write those plays. But then, the stumbling block to this theory is the fact that Edward died too early into Shakespeare's career. Shakespeare still wrote about 10 more plays after Edward died. So it's either Edward already wrote these plays before he died, or maybe he actually isn't Shakespeare. Speaking of death, death was the very reason why some people settled with the Marvolian conspiracy over the Oxfordian narrative. This conspiracy was drawn around the idea that Christopher Marlowe, a contemporary playwright and poet, was the real Shakespeare. This angle is also very valid on many accounts. Firstly, Marlowe was a passionate, skilled, but very shy writer. The guy even faked his own death just to make his anonymity less noticeable. Yet he continued writing behind closed doors, and guess what his pseudonym was? William Shakespeare. And if you actually take the time to study his literary works, he had excellent penmanship and impeccable skill, just like you-know-who. So could he really have been the Shakespeare we all revere? Oh, and there's this prominent statesman and philosopher, Sir Francis Bacon, who lived in the Elizabethan era. He's another suspect on the long list of suspects. But his case is quite peculiar. His existence in the same era as Shakespeare, interesting writing style, philosophical ideas, themes, and even the motifs around his plays are very similar to Shakespeare's. He brings up a strong argument, but there are a few loopholes in that narrative. In Shakespeare's defense, one of the world's foremost Shakespeareans, Professor Sir Stanley Wells, CBE, FRSL, actually once said he was a late developer. Does this mean that Shakespeare developed elsewhere? Where then? It would have been really hard in that era. Books were very scarce and hard to get. There were no public libraries to sneak into and coke out as an Einstein, unless the Earl of Southampton, his supposed patron, had a great library where Shakespeare went to study often. But that would be hard to believe because there are no records that show that Shakespeare ever paid the Earl a visit. If no one remembered, the servants would have remembered if Shakespeare actually spent those 7 lost years, or at least a fraction of them, with his head buried in the Earl's library. Shakespeare had a vocabulary of more than 20,000 words. That's not a small feat. Plus, he invented more words and phrases than any other writer had. But he didn't get credited for it by most because his story just doesn't add up. How did he know so much about other countries and cultures to the details, especially Italy in a day and time, where traveling was only for the rich except for extremely poor individuals who smuggled themselves out from one country to another in the hope of greener pastures? How can a man who lived 400 years ago set records that no one has been able to beat in quality and quantity, even in this age where we have better technology and easier access to a lot of things that he might have struggled to get? How could he write so richly with superior knowledge about the English court? How did he have such a superior understanding of things like high-level politics? How could a man who didn't even seem to have a love life to begin with manage to write such powerful books about love that bring tears to the eye? We still have him to thank for words like hoodwinked, tongue-tied, and in a pickle, although he sure seems to be in a pickle right now. That alone is an incredible feat for one man, if he was one man. But was it really one man? And that's the actual basis for the group authorship theory. It is believed that perhaps Shakespeare wasn't a person, but rather a group of the finest authors, poets, playwrights, and even scholars from the Elizabethan era. What do you think? Either way, the big question remains, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. More than 70 other people have been suggested as the true author, but just like Shakespeare, none of them fit perfectly. Not even once did Shakespeare ever claim any of the works we call his own today. He neither claimed nor disowned them. Just like other writers, he could have owned his world by talking about them in letters, saying something that people could remember in quotes. Anything. All that glitters is not gold. We might never really know if Shakespeare actually wrote his plays. There isn't enough evidence to say he did, but there also isn't enough evidence to say he didn't. But what do you think? We'd like to hear your opinion on the subject. Drop your comments in the comment section and subscribe to our channel for more intriguing pieces like this. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.